refreshments. Welcome to the Department of History seminar series. So if people would like to grab some refreshments up at the front. Gray day, and here in Kingston, and March weather, unanticipated March weather, especially for Holi, which is the Festival of Colors, March 24th. So we're welcoming you to a lecture by Indrani Chatterjee, who's joined us from much warmer climate at University of Texas, Austin. And just a few words of introduction. My introduction is going to be very inadequate because Dr. Chatterjee, Professor Chatterjee, has an extraordinary body of work, body of research that she's produced over these years, beginning with her first book, Gender, Slavery, Law in Colonial India. She currently teaches at the University of Texas, Austin, but she's previously taught at Rutgers and University of California, Davis, after receiving her degree from SOAS. And she's been the recipient of numerous awards from Yale, Princeton, as well as in India and the United Kingdom. Her work really crosses all sorts of frontiers. 1975, I was thinking about it, was the first Women's World Conference in Mexico City, and it's then that it was first proposed to put women's labor into the indices and the metrics of the GDP. And up until that time, of course, women's domestic labor was not counted, was not calculated. And in many ways, what Indrani Chatterjee has been doing has been really to put women in terms of labor, in terms of race, in terms of networks and politics into the center of her work, beginning with her first book, and then continuing in other works, pioneering works on the history of slavery and servile labor, including an off-cited work that she wrote with Richard M. Eaton in 2007, an edited work, as well as the introduction. So these new frontiers that Dr. Chatterjee has sort of explored also include more recently a book that just came out in 2013, and that book is called Forgotten Friends, Monks, Marriage, and Memories, which is really a very interesting work which takes her into new dimensions, although there's still a gendered chapter, and brings her work very to the edges of what had been sort of the center of South Asian history to the Himalayan regions, and looking at a region of great cultural and religious diversity, and trying to recover over this longue durée these relationships from various monastic and religious communities and professional communities that have all been sort of parceled out and put into pigeonholes during the colonial period. And she, it's quite remarkable also for the fact that you've done very original methodologies of oral history, as well as using unlikely sources, religious texts. So today, I think we're going to be getting a slice of a new body of work that she's working on, because I've noticed she's got a number of articles pending that have to do with, again, with gender is in the mix, but also more to do with economics and property, and as well as in this case, sort of turning the categories, including the post-structural categories, on their head, or retooling them, reconceptualizing them in terms of South Asian history. And again, much of her work, especially on slavery, does not ignore the global context, but tries to reinsert, as she was doing here, this provincial context, the specificity of pre-colonial and post and colonial relationships on the ground. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk. My brief introduction does not do justice to your work, and she'll be talking on Provincialising British Abolition, 1807-1843, from the perspective of pre-colonial South Asia. Let's welcome Indrani. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. That was a very warm and very generous introduction, which I'm not sure I deserve. And thank you, Adnan, for absolutely marvelous, such gracious hospitality. And thank you, Ishita, for being such a stalwart friend of mine all these years. So thank you also for new and old friends here. I didn't realize how many of my old friends were also in the audience, so I'm delighted to find them here again. This is already wonderful. It's Holi, happy Holi. It's fun to be here. But I'm going to do something which I have to beg your forgiveness for. And I'll explain this. In an influential essay on colonial governmentality in 1999, David Scott referred to transformations so profound that the old, and I'm quoting him, that the old pre-modern possibilities are no longer conceptually approachable, except in the languages of the modern. And that is precisely what I'm going to do here. I'm going to approach the conceptually unapproachable, and I'm begging your forgiveness for making you take those steps with me, because it's going to be a little hard. It's probably going to be uncomfortable for many of us, and it is certainly going to push a few buttons, given my experience with this talk elsewhere. So let me begin. One cannot provincialize or decolonize abolition without actually beginning with trying to decolonize slavery. And I hope you agree with that. So the audience that I'm approaching here, or it's a conversation I've been having with Orlando Patterson for the very longest time. Those of you who know Orlando Patterson's work will know his classic Slavery and Social Death, which had argued that slavery was an experience of violence, natal alienation, and permanent dishonor. My disagreement with this position now, after 20 odd years of working in the field, is this. It's actually threefold. First, it's not methodologically productive to evade a discussion of property laws in societies where those laws exist. Patterson tries to do that by saying, let's focus on the experience, rather than discuss this Pandora's box of law. Second, it's self-defeating for historians of these societies because it impels them, such as us in South Asia, West Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, to ignore a great deal of source materials in languages and forms from those societies we all study. And I'm thinking here of lyric poetry from the subcontinent in multiple languages that we can think of, the northern or the southern, in which the poet, singer, yearns to be the slave of a god or a high beloved person being addressed. And I'm thinking with and locating myself in that lyric poetry and thinking back and outward and saying, why have post-colonial theorists not thought through this body of work? What is it that makes them unable or uncomfortable with thinking through this body of work? Why is it so hard to locate ourselves in those lyrics? And third, evading this kind of evidence leaves intact the implicit universalism of the experiences of a very specific group of workers brought from the vast African continent to a variety of plantations in the Atlantic. And it does not even comprehend fully the experiences of similarly originating workers in the Indian Ocean world, which is why this poster is a very important reminder that women like this figure came from the African continent and were absorbed within very eminent, comfortable, substantial, hegemonic households in a variety of roles. So I'm not going to go into that. I've worked on that, and I'm trying to think outwards from there. So let me jump in to the 5 different aspects of property that I'm going to lay out before you, and I take for granted that you will accept them and we'll move on from there, okay? If you don't, we will battle it out later. Okay, first, and I'm standing on the work of my colleagues in UT Austin, such as Donald Davis Jr., who's an eminent scholar of Hindu law and Sanskrit texts. He's an eminent scholar of many things, but he's written on property in Hindu law. So it's his work that I'm trying to bring together in this. All property was categorized as either mobile or immobile, one. Second, following Michael Ongthuen, I'm going to argue that property should always be discussed in terms of its owners. So the question was never whether a person was a slave or not, but the question was, to whom are you bonded and for what purpose? In other words, it's not, are you a slave or not? It's, whose property are you? Okay? It's not, are you a property or not? Whose property are you? And what kind of property are you? What are you supposed to be doing in that relationship? As modern scholars such as Don Davis have argued, the ideal owner in the texts that he is looking at, the Dharma Shastra, was the extended family, Kula, that performed rituals of birth and death. In these early systems, all property was admitted to be socially constructed, and this is very important for us to get. The jurists placed both the definition of property and ownership within the same ontological terrain. So the argument here is that something is property, or whose property is this, is on the same terrain as establishing the procedural aspect of how to determine that. Okay, so who gets to decide what is property is the same group of people who will then give judgment on whether that is property or not, and whose property this person is or not. This has procedural implications because that certain something was property was always rested on practical observation, cognition by several people, including the owners and the contestants. The procedural implications of witnessing, personalized knowledge was important to establish title and then the integrity of all transactions in property, such as lease, hire, sale, mortgage, etc. All these actions were known in the texts. They were known, they were discussed. These are not novel or particular to modern law, contrary to a lot of my colleagues who have claimed such things. Since all locus of ownership of property lay in the wider family, jurists had to go to great lengths to protect co-ownership rights in property, balance multiple proprietary rights with usufructuary rights, and so on. So the pledged slave could not be used in particular ways by the person who was taking that pledge on lease or on hire. They could not sell them. There are many provisions of this. If you want to discuss this with your undergraduate class, the Arthashastra is a very good text to teach from for that reason. It works wonders in my classrooms. Similarly, contemporary Buddhist codes, such as the Mula Sarvastivad texts, such as the ones that Greg Chopin has worked on, has written into the guidance of ordained men by other monks that monks were not to lure laymen's property into the monasteries and then buy or sell them. Okay? In other words, even monks were being told, protect laymen's property and don't lure them in here, which may get you into trouble with the laymen on whom you depend for your food and subsistence. Okay? On the other hand, within the same texts, you have discussions of gift giving of the same properties by laymen to monks. So you can find female slaves, young children inside the monastic orders, monasteries, but they're not owned by individual, they've not been bought up, they've been gifted. And gifted slaves is a particularly sacrosanct property. The gift to a monastery, and we'll come to that, and this is why I'm coming back to slavery after having worked on monastic lineages, is precisely because there's so much evidence of this kind of gifting of both individuals and entire villages, 400 households, to particular deities, to particular monasteries with their estates. South Asian historians, not interested in looking at that. So, me at the boundary there. Okay. So the third thing that I want to talk about is that whose property you are is determined by ecology. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because I'm looking at this Himalayan terrain and the foothills where there are very fierce rivers, road transportation is very hard to build. Everything depends on human labor. Even carrying a sack of rice or wheat needs a human back. And every bit of fields that you cultivate needs a human hand. Every bit of human labor is very valuable. So gifting of humans is a very high order of gifting. It's a very high order of property and value that is specific to this ecology. And therefore, I think we need to be environmentally sensitive when we start talking about legalities of property and law in this terrain. That's my third submission. And of course, we find many skilled female workers in temples. My colleague here knows this. She can expound on this better than I can, such as in southern India between the 10th and 14th centuries. Gifts of specially favored females to Hindu and Jain and some Buddhist monks, deities, temples are widely recorded in this subcontinent. Devesh Sonaji's worked on this, so you can look up any number of books on this. These females were the Tavaratiyal, the devotee or daughter of God, temple servant. To make such gifts was to sequester such beings from circulation, use and abuse at the hands of the lay human actors. To gift to a god was to remove them from lay men's use. Okay. To be thus the slave of a god, a deity, or a teacher was to occupy a protected and privileged status as a result. Fourth, the model of attaching individuals and families that I've been talking about to either a monastic teacher or to a lay military commander rested on the implicit recognition that the persons thus attached were to be protected. The term is protected. Sharan, to be given refuge. In other words, to be provided for, to be maintained by their owners. The claims of attached bonded workers to support and claims to serve in particular capacities were thus inherited, and this was also premised on the prior ability of slaves to earn and keep the income and therefore to bequeath to and inherit from related patrons, kinsmen, and women. Fifth, all lay and ecclesiastical governors, by virtue of maintaining these laws, maintaining two different sets of lay property and monastic property, had to be involved in safeguarding the procedural aspects of transactions in property, such as sale, hire, lease, etc. Documents from the 13th century chancery show deeds of transfers of slaves that have to be fully witnessed by a minimum of 5 significant men, heads of different professions in the neighborhood of the city, and we can go into the sources for that if you want to. So all these 5 aspects of older property regimes were absorbed into the practices of Central and West Asian Turkic, Afghan, and Mongol governors who settled in the subcontinent from the 13th century onwards, with just one shift. And this is a shift that I'm willing to be educated on if people want to talk about this. But the shift that I find is the unit of ownership of a slave. Unlike in Hindu law texts, I cannot find a single instance of a collective that owns a single slave. Islamic legal theory seems to not support an entire family owning one slave. Only one person at a time could. So Adnan, if you can find discussion of anybody else, tell me if there is something that I don't know that I'm missing here. The wife's right to transact in her husband's property as well had to be expressly written into her marriage agreement. This singularity of proprietorship could also protect the slave from being used or abused by those who were not her owners. But perhaps due to this difference, again, one finds much greater traces of caution regarding the forms in which such properties were transferred between lay and ecclesiastical institutions. Lay governors developed very high stakes in monitoring civil transactions, such as gifts, sales, inheritance. They all had to be recorded, and descriptions minutely of who these properties are, what their ages are, what their skill sets are. All of these are in the records of these transactions. That's the context which is making me come back to looking at property law very closely again, because the body of work that I've found addresses exactly the concern that is uppermost in South Asian politics today, caste. I find in the records when Hindu Rajput officers working within or alongside Mughal administrators are thinking of extending or protecting settlement in this entire Brahmaputra or Himalayan foothills river valley system, they did so by dedicating vast numbers of people to deities living on inviolably sacred estates. There's a parallel with the Waqf here, which people will recognize from law, Islamic law. Entire households and assemblies were gifted to the gods. Few modern readers of such documents understand the significance of these charters, so let me spell them out. In the Brahmaputra river valley, in whose records I've been working, a majority of such gifted households were of non-Brahmin groups, i.e. workers, from a variety of occupations and statuses. Some amongst this cluster were skilled workers, literate, numerate, called Kayastha or Bhandar Kayath, respectively. Others carried the emblems of authority, the umbrella, the stave, the trident, significant in displays of dignity of the deity. Included amongst this group were those who worked with waste products, such as hair, skin, blood, excreta, such as the barber who took away the hair, the clipped nails, which are supposed to be defiling, the cobbler who works with dead skin, leather, the sweeper. All of these groups are collectively enumerated in the charters as Chandal. The significance of why I'm even bringing it to you, to your attention, is that these detailed lists of the caste status of such gifts is that they all are protected within or share in the exemption from taxation that the monastic estate or the deity enjoyed within the boundaries of the lands in which they lived. Thus, even those workers with the lowest ritual rank, the so-called, in our terms, untouchables, today's Dalits, within the 18th century charters and even late 17th century charters, are clearly marked out as exempt from paying labor services or cash dues to third parties not attached to the monastic estate. That is, the Englishman comes along, demands labor from a Chandal. The Chandal is in his or her right not to give that labor. Get it? That's why it's important to recognize what's going on in these charters. As in adjacent Buddhist regimes of Burma, Nepal, and Tibet, these attached workers too remained exempt from the lay militia commander's demands for military labor service, a significant life-preserving, physical integrity preserving privilege available only to the slaves of the monasteries. Payakung is the Burmese term for it. In eastern India too, therefore, becoming the slaves of gods exempted cultivators, artisans, and merchants from being destroyed by war. For these reasons, documenting these transfers became extremely important. We have lots and lots of charters of this kind. So what does happen from the late 18th century when English law first arrives in the plains, actually? In the plains, it's the households where such slaves are protected, are preserved, are actually, their children have some basic rights, they have some basic claims to maintenance. The women, once they have given birth to children, will be treated as Umevaled, that is mother in the lineage, mother of the lineage. They can claim certain kinds of maintenance, jewelry, pensions, stipends. Those begin to fray. As the East India Company moves up into this terrain from 1826 that I've been tracking, the monastic estates come under attack. And women and children attached to these households come under attack in the way that they are called servile. The estates that protect them and own them and claim them are called feudal, barbaric, savage, and it's also, therefore, part of an evangelical tirade against Hinduism and Islam going on at the same time. So, what in sort of a sentence, or not a sentence, a phrase or a simple way of putting it, what would abolition come to mean in such a terrain? It would come to mean that Indian owners lost their ability to protect their own properties from being destroyed or damaged by third parties. The final ignominy would come when monastic owners and lay governors alike could no longer sustain either their own exemption from labor nor extend such exemptions to either very old or very favored slaves, which they had used many different kinds of legal provisions to do earlier. And the forces that brought this about, to those of you who are specialists in history, I don't need to spell out. You know this is the rise of industrialism, this is the conflict of mercantilist armies between France and England in the Indian Ocean as much as in North America at that time. There is a clash going on in terms of labor. Who gets to control whose labor pool? And this then is fit into the second rise of evangelicalism from the late 18th, but particularly the early 19th century. And the rise of evangelicalism is important because there is such a cross-class and transoceanic set of linkages that are achieved as a result of the anti-slavery, abolitionist ventures and clubs. It draws middle-class English women into political terrain in the context of 19th century England. But what it does, looking at the same wonderful growth of feminism in the Western world, is also the ending or the fading of a certain kind of legal regime, very well protected Mughal property regime in the Indian Ocean world. So the growth of feminism in the West becomes, as it were, part of the story of the end of the Mughal regime in the Indian Ocean world. And this is something that I've been trying to address in my new work, which is why I'm going back into the 18th century, which is why I'm going back into law, into property again. And I just want to give, do I have 10 minutes?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I just want to give two examples of how this should be seen. The reason I'm saying this is because, liberating slaves from the slavers in the Indian Ocean world has hitherto been presented to us as this glorious deed. I am arguing that that's not at all the case. What is going on in the 1830s is this grabbing of labor, which is already ready to be used in the subcontinent in different ways, and diverting it into the British Navy, into the British workshops, etc. And that's where I'm going to give my examples from. From 1833, when the East India Company finally lost its monopoly of trade and India was thrown open to a range of private capital, both Anglican and Puritan missionaries, as well as British private traders and industrialists, began to attack the modes by which laborers were kept off the market by various forms of religious attachments. Baptist missionaries in newly annexed Assam of 1836, for instance, called for the liberation of the 800-odd disciples, the attached oblates, bhakts, of a Vaishnav abbot, Mahanta. This demand for liberation persisted even though missionaries knew that unlike the African slaves they were used to describing, these monastic servants, and I'm quoting them, did not work round the clock, but only when the monastic lords required their services, i.e., this is inefficient use of labor. If they were free, they would be efficiently used, right? So this system, the missionary declared, was made possible by the structure of endowed lands, referring particularly to the Vaishnav monastic estates, whole thousands of puras, huge estates, of waste jungle. This missionary charged that the endowments had encouraged a great body of people in idleness. And that was what was being addressed by abolition, by liberation. British military officers also wanted to attach the same pools of labor. They were very thin on labor. They were very thin on loyal labor and on the ground in this area. And so they were willing to go along and work out some compromises with the missionaries. So what happened was the missionaries were going to train these people in the skills and English languages and so on, and then the military would employ them as soldiers, and there would be this lovely, arrangement, a nice feeding arrangement. Colonial officers compelled old Vaishnav abbots to contribute military contingents, despite the fact that these abbots refused, they resisted for a long time. But basically, this is the project of liberation. This is the project of freedom in this terrain. The same liberation that I'm just referring to was practiced in Western Indian Ocean world in the 1830s, when the British Navy secured the domination of the seas enough to stop and search all European ships suspected of carrying slaves. Alpers has summed it up succinctly when he says, these naval patrols turned a vast Indian Ocean into, I quote, a British lake. Abolitionism here allowed British navies and colonial officials to absorb African youth on these ships into a laboring group in British-controlled workshops. For instance, in 1835-36, exactly the same years in which the Vaishnav abbots are losing their bhakts in Assam, 70 young African boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 15 were forcibly taken off the Arab-commanded dhows sailing between Porbandar, that's a port in Gujarat, and Bombay, today's Mumbai. Instead of the secretarial and treasury work and a status of some kind within such households that such children had earlier been led to expect, these African and Muslim boys in the 1830s were now either sent directly to work on the boats of the British Indian Navy or handed over as private servants to British naval officers such as Captain Henderson, the agent for clothing in the army, who had estates in the Cape of Good Hope. So what you're getting is a diversion away from the subcontinent into the Atlantic world, into the Cape of Good Hope, into and outwards into the Latin American context subsequently. Yet others were given to British police constables and army officers and clerks in the British Indian bureaucracy. The girls were put to domestic service in establishments managed by individual British and Portuguese functionaries in Mumbai. Their new employers contracted to feed, clothe, and protect them, the same clauses, protect, sharan, and above all, bring them up as Christians. It did not matter which church. Even the Catholic Vicar General of the Apostolic Mission received a free gift of 7 African servants in this general distribution of gifts. So liberation of such African children expanded the empire of Christ as well. Christopher Brown has suggested that to convert slaves to Christianity tends to look more like an attack on the Africans' cultural inheritance, an attempt to colonize the spirit to better exploit the body. This is really worth thinking with and thinking about because of 2 reasons. One, such abolition or such conversion was not allowed under Mughal law. There are decrees where Muhammad Raza Khan actually says, guarantees to the Portuguese minister that if your slaves run away, they will not be converted, we will return them to you. In the 18th century. A very different project unfolds in the 1830s in these coastal towns and under this kind of abolitionist liberation. The second reason that this is significant to note is because in the records themselves, there is evidence that these boys resisted. They ran away, they fought back. The words are, they acted out. They refused to serve Christians, quote unquote. They acted out. They were wayward. These are the descriptions of them. And we know, as historians, reading against the grain, what that acting out might mean, what being wayward might mean. So many of these, their reluctance was ultimately overcome by putting them directly in a British-run school, quote unquote, saying nothing about religion, quote unquote, and shaping them indirectly into a regime of work. By the way, I grew up in one such school, and I was taught work is worship. You don't have to do anything else. And that's, I believe, very close to what we are seeing in these records. Only the most stubborn of such resistors, usually young boys, could evade a mandatory Christianization and run away. So finally, what does this set of liberation policies mean? It actually means a reversal of property laws of the older world, which had been protected by Mughal actions, as well as those hegemons who subscribed to the bigger West Asian, South Asian, Safavid, Ottoman, Mughal systems of networks and trade, and respected each other's properties and gave them back. When ships were wrecked and slaves landed on one coast who should have been somewhere else, they were actually returned. That kind of pattern began to fade. And I'll try and sum up here. What does provincializing British abolitionism then imply? It means thinking with the delegitimated concepts of property in pluralist, pre-colonial regimes of law and administration, looking out at British colonial and evangelical measures and institutions from that older epistemological and political location, brings home the enormous triumphalism of abolitionist liberalism. What is most obvious about this triumph is how completely modern secular liberals, such as myself, have gone along with Christian evangelicals to wipe out the claims of non-Christian legal regimes to be treated seriously within their own terms. Neither pre-colonial Asian histories of property nor the worldviews of pre-colonial Asian poet, musicians, performers, who once sung of themselves as slaves of the Dargah or slaves of the Sultan, find a dignified place in this historiography of British abolitionism. In failing to account for such worlds of meaning, scholars of the 20th century have only obscured from themselves the extent to which we have all succumbed to the after effects of liberal and laymen's seizures of other people's wealth in the 19th century. The Mughals might have called it theft. We call it freedom. Thank you. Oh, sure. Yeah, but you.
Open for questions. Dr. Shah.
So one thing I really took from the talk was this idea of symbolizing the universality of the Atlantic slave experience. Do you see this particular project of provincializing British abolition as a counter-narrative to that universal, or as a methodological intervention into the field? Is this a methodology that historians focusing on slavery should adopt, or is this a counter-narrative in which those historians can build upon?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. Remind me, are you in graduate program?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I love that. I think that one cannot do the counter-narrative without a methodological disruption. And that's why I began with trying to lay out those 5 positions on property. Right? We have all inherited this understanding that human beings cannot be property. It's a very particular liberal 19th century legal intervention. Okay? If we buy into that right from the outset, we have therefore shut out this entire pre-modern understanding of property that is simultaneously a methodological invitation to think through other regimes of property, other ways of belonging, other ways of claiming, being protected. So I would say that I'm trying to do both. I'm trying to offer you not just a critique of what those guys got wrong. I'm trying to offer you an alternative, substantive way of proceeding from a very different epistemological discussion and framing. And saying that, look, if you look at it this way and locate yourself here, then that narrative is, my narrative is a counter-narrative. Right? So it is both methodological and its end result is a counter-narrative. Does that satisfy you?
Yeah.
Yes, I might ask you a question. Just a bit of preface, because it's interesting as a fellow 18th centuryist. It's interesting to be, looking at the world, prospectively rather than retrospectively, especially from this the cusp of major changes. From the Ottoman historiographical perspective, however, we've seemingly pendulum has swung the other way. So what used to be a very, very fulsome, almost apology for Ottoman slavery, of various types, military slavery, household slavery, as being very paternalistic, emphasizing the concept, especially in the Ottoman royal household, where you had serial concubinage, according to Leslie Gross, of the primacy of this designation of being the mother of the child, and therefore, you know, the children in Islamic law, even of a servile enslaved person, are, if the father is free, are free, so there's no inheritance. But seemingly we've come the other way. The direction is shifted with the works of Toledano. And I forgot what her name is. She's at University of Georgia, who's working on, who's done a number of slave narratives. The problem I see with those, you know, those two positions, and again, I think it comes from a point of view of perspective, is that most of the critique is now coming from the 19th century, from those people who are studying slavery in the 19th century. And I'm wondering, you know, do we not risk romanticizing the pre-modern, the pre-colonial in this process, even as we de-emphasize the paternalistic aspects, the protectiveness, and the multiplicity of servile statuses that continue into the colonial period, or into the period in which abolition as an extension, you know, to a great degree of liberal economics becomes a global phenomenon. I'm sorry if this is too complicated, but it's playing these two historiographies off each other,
I entirely sympathize with the question, because I've been working with Ehud for a very long time, and he's given me a lot to think with. But here's my problem. I am not romanticizing, as you've noticed. I therefore do not evade the question of property. Okay, I think it is romantic to not discuss property, because property is what it's ultimately all about in the conflict in empire, okay, or between empires, and property law, etc. is where it all boils down to, and is dramatically changed. So my way of addressing this debate is to say, no, I'm not romanticizing by actually looking at property.
at the terms of in which.
Absolutely. But it is also a historical fact that we are now living with, in the South Asian context at least, that there is something called a religious communalism. Okay? And how do you address this issue, except as the Marxists did before my time, which was to say that's all false consciousness. Actually, I'm not convinced anymore, because I now find that there are these commitments that people have made to honor this and that teacher, to do a certain set of things, and I think we need to take this seriously, right? Politically, as an intervention, we need to take this seriously. So that's what is driving my project, that if we have to tackle the present in a systematic way, we have to do the pre-colonial also equally systematically. We can't evade the demands of the pre-colonial on South Asians. What the Ottomanists are faced with is a different set of issues. Is that of the Ottoman Empire across a vast North African, Mediterranean world, which also has stakes in disrupting the empire. And I think, I would locate some of the work that people are doing in the 19th century, like, and looking back at the 18th century, in that broader politics. My project is located in a very much more present politics of the present century in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, because none of these places were ready-made till 1947, right? And so many of the histories that I'm talking about actually connect all these sites. And that is why no one in those countries wants to teach my work.
No, can I, if I'm not usurping, no, what I think was also the question I was actually trying to grapple with is whether the critique you have of slavery that has, been traditionally made in a South Asian context, which comes from, unwittingly, from this notion that abolition equals freedom and this intervention is somehow legitimate on the sort of a broader scale of human rights, is something that Ottomanists have tended to absorb at this point. In this sort of revisionist, because people like Ehud are sort of revisionist in a way, to this sort of standard narrative, which was much closer to what you're talking about, which was looking at the nuances and the protections, the degree of protections that were built in to a system of servile labor that guaranteed, for example, in Hanafi law, that slaves could own property. Slaves, that slavery, and that slavery was not an inherited status.
Absolutely.
So making it very different from the kind of Atlantic slavery that was imposed on transplanted Africans.
Right.
So I'm just all I'm saying is that I think that your critique could come back and also help us to perhaps be a cautionary note and in the swing toward the other direction, which comes out of historians who were working in the 19th century, many of them who were using colonial documents. So they're reading through and perhaps not reading as carefully through.
Yeah, my own thing with that is, it's not the nature of language or documents that we are using. I think we don't have alternative concepts in our brains before we go to any set of documents. I mean, people have read the Bangla or the Persian or the Ohmiya text that I have been looking at for ages. I'm not the first person who's stumbling on these records. They just never have had this concept, say, that I've published, those of you who want to look it up, monastic governmentality or pastoral subjecthood. You have to take that seriously into account if you are going to actually deal politically and intellectually with the project of explaining commitment, military action, militant action on behalf of XYZ. I think we need to let ourselves give up some of our 19th century attachments. And so that's where I'm trying to push this conversation. That if you think this would work with the Ottomanists, I'd be happy to sit down and talk with them. But I've actually learned a lot.
No, I know, but I'm
from
just
them.
questioning this, as I said, this pendulum swing.
I see another hand, yes.
Yeah, I'm curious, you described the Muslim African boys in the 1830s acting out against being bonded to a Royal Navy ship or put in a missionary's household. Did they also act out though when they were bonded to a god, or?
I've been looking for those records just as a balancing thing, that, do I see that? I haven't seen them being attached to a god and defined as African. That's the transition that happens, is we can't, ethnicity or skin color is not the first characteristic that is noted when an oblate is gifted to a temple. What is noted is the skill or the origin. So I can find names like Liaquat or Lakshmi Singh or XYZ, names of people given, but I can't find their ethnicity there. So I can't find whether this is somebody who's coming from Africa, has transited from Mumbai and has been up here. I have found odd stray cases of women running, female Africans running away from particular households like the Nawab of Arcot, the Awadh household as well. But that's always because they have an alternative household they want to set up. And they want to go away with an entire set of people from this household into another household. So they're basically either changing masters or they are actually setting up in another terrain altogether, another household altogether. That's the kind of record of resistance that I find. But to the gods, I have not been able to track whether this is, this person, when devoted to a god, is resisting. I can't find that in the records. And that makes me also wonder why they're not there. Are they not being gifted to the gods? Are they, being kept in the households, in the lay households in the 1830s? There are lots of records of the African stewards, very important, very major stewards of, they're the treasurers, they're the commanders of household troops in various of these households. There are lots of records describing them. Some of them make tons of money because they have the right to lease farms, they have the right to do various things. So some of them, in fact, do go to British courts in order to register their properties. So they want to collaborate with British courts by the 1850s in order to ensure that the slave child or the slave concubine they have nurtured or maintained gets their share of property, because they know that after 1842 all of this is going to go away. So they are trying very hard to finesse their ways through the legal system as well in the 1850s. So that record is there. Yes?
Do you think of your argument as limited to contributing to our understanding of the impact and the experience of abolition in South Asia, or do you consider your argument, in a sense, an intervention in understanding the very motivations of the abolitionists at the center? Are you sort of obliquely participating in the Eric Williams debate or something?
You tell me. I would like to be modest. Historians, I think, particularly tracking this kind of work, have to be extremely cautious, rooted in their evidence, and I have not done enough research on the motivations of the churchmen in England. And so, as a cautious and I hope well-trained historian, I will not allow myself to impute motives. I don't know what their motives were. I can see their results on the ground. And that is what I will limit myself to discussing. If people see that as an intervention, and they can build upon it in some way, all power to them. I have not closed off that possibility, if that helps. Whenever an encyclopedia on slavery and abolition is put out and the editors will say or contribute something, even if I am desperate and dying, I will contribute. Because I know it's important for that little bit of an interruption to be there. Not that everybody will read it. People will just say, not important anymore. But at least it's there. And it's up to others to read it. I don't know whether they will. I can't guarantee it's there. This is my limited, very modest answer. Does that work?
No, it's your choice,
Yeah, it's. I'm not an ambitious person. I'm just a cautious. Yes.
Thank you very much. This has been fascinating. I'm a 20th century historian and learned a lot. I didn't know that freedom was imposed on people the way free trade on China, coercively imposed on China and elsewhere. And I'm wondering about some of the complexity of the pre-modern property systems that you described. So a few questions about that. Okay, just two. One is, I'm getting the sense that given the fact there were shared property rights, that there might also have been distinct forms of property rights. For instance, claims on a piece of mobile property to do some things but not other things. And secondly, could someone who was property herself own some other person
Yes.
or share property
Yes.
rights in that person?
Yes, yes,
Oh.
yes. That's
Fascinating.
this is in evidence. This is there. That people who are themselves property are allowed to own or share in other properties, both mobile and immobile. That's in evidence. Some of the evidence is anecdotal. For the earlier part, you'll have narratives of the Buddha or narratives. There are narrative bits of discussions of this. We don't have the charters quite in the way that we have them for the 18th century. But that slaves hold slaves? Absolutely. That slaves own have claims in fixed property such as houses, trees, lands, income from lands, shops? Absolutely. That's another thing that one has to then mull over, right? So it's not just slaves, but whose slaves get to own those? And that's the story that we don't tell enough. And my submission would be that the reason that we don't like telling these stories is precise, at least in South Asia, because we have two blocks in our head. One is called elite and the other is called subaltern. Now, the problem is that in order to find slaves who own slaves, slaves who have property rights, you have to look at the households of the elite. And if you study the households of the elite, you get called elitist. But you can't plead when all the reviewers have already, characterized you as elitist. You can't plead that, hey, I'm looking at slave property, so give me a break. And on the other hand, actually when you start looking at the subalterns or the category that's called subaltern, you find that many of these are actually the estate-owned people, which then nobody wants to talk about either. Because they're not bouncing off and acting out on their own. They're also being commanded to act on behalf of. Right? So our worlds of agency, individualism, willed action, struggle, all of those get muddied. That's the problem. That gets us all very uncomfortable. Too much has to be redefined. Right? And so that's a struggle here. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yes, Ishita.
So I think I'm just maybe following up a little bit on David's question, but in a slightly different way. And I am pushing you to be less modest and more ambitious perhaps. Because in some ways what you are saying is that we need to think of property and property in humans outside of liberal modernist categories of thought. Now that is clearly a claim that goes beyond just looking at the particularities of South Asia, right? So maybe you can help us think through how that claim looks beyond South Asia, if you want to. But I'm also wondering if there are any friends you're forgetting in making this argument, right? So I'm curious as an unreformed South Asianist, modernist, in some ways, I've been trying to get offended, right? Because I feel like there's something in there that you're saying that should make me
Very angry.
Very angry. But I didn't get angry, right? As I failed to get angry. So I'm wondering if there are, in fact, there is, in fact, there are some friends in these sort of post-colonial scholars and these subaltern scholars that you're forgetting who actually would join you in thinking of property outside of personal friends.
Oh,
If that is the sort of if that is one of the strands of what key strands of what you're doing is, and I think, and this links back to Emily's question as well, and I'm thinking also of what changes in the late 18th, early 19th centuries in terms of these alternative epistemologies and these alternative legal understandings of property that then become part of a liberal structure of law, right? In the sense that there are understandings of property that might be limited to the family and therefore limited to the domestic sphere as opposed to what we continue to understand as economy per se in the 19th century after the Rochdale Conference. But that there's something going on there that these alternative ways of thinking about property in humans has now become part of the colonial or the modern, so to speak. Do you see where I'm going? So that we might that we might be missing out on an appreciation for alternative forms of property or alternative ways of conceptualizing property that linger on, obviously, but that have but that in being called property that is now in the family domain is sort of lost again when we are looking at documents.
Those are very complex questions, I think, and
Maybe I'm not being clear.
no, I think we need to talk about this with actual examples because, the discussion might well be lost to most other people here. I entirely take my place in the body of work that my title tells you, provincializing. I mean, come on, that very word will tell you that, of course, I'm friends with Dipesh, and of course, I'm borrowing from him, and of course, I stand in that enterprise. But, the reason that I'm saying what I'm saying is that I've also had disagreements with Partho on this. He was the one who first said, you don't talk about caste. And I said, but I can't talk about caste without actually upsetting your understanding of what caste is. Because if I tell you that here are these monastic estates where the lowest of the castes are actually protected, you're going to beat me up. Because that's not how it's supposed to be narrated. The story of caste is supposed to be that the lowest castes are the most oppressed by the Brahmins. And I can't find a Brahmin, and I find that these castes are being protected. So how am I supposed to tell this narrative? Right? So that's the conflict that exists within us, and us South Asianists are famously, argumentative. So I take this as not forgetting my friends, but fighting with them within the club itself. And second, property in humans outside liberalism is precisely what the project is. My friends in this enterprise is everybody who's looking at property, and in fact, I find some of my best friends are the ones who are working in Roman law. They are fabulous. They think through very, very tightly on this issue, and I draw a lot from them. And also people who are working on Waqf law are great friends of mine. I draw on them a lot. So I have my friends, and I'm willing to spend a lot of time talking about those friends. I'm drawing on all of them, and I think I'm part of that endeavor as well. But, you know, let's be honest here. We are in a world after decolonization. Some parts of the world are not fashionable. They're not the trendsetters.
Mm-hmm.
It's not hip to be looking at pre-colonial South Asia for concepts. Concepts only come from Europe, right? So that's the context in which I've chosen to talk about property. And I'm saying, okay, so we have all of that in common. That's common ground, right? So we'll talk from that common ground. And that's where my larger intellectual, political adventure here is. Is some parts of what I'm talking about being taken over and adjudicated? I think you're absolutely right. Some parts of what I'm discussing here were taken on very early on as family law or domain of the family. Those relationships then became not legal but paralegal, under the purview. You know, they cannot be actually claimed in a court of law. They can only to claim for a servant. Servants exist. They may not be all bought up, but they have very similar circuits by which they arrive in the households. For them to now claim that, you know, my Malik should have given me this piece of land is unheard of in law. It becomes the act of the individual Malik, the individual proprietor, the kindness of the Malik, okay? And the memory of the Malik's descendants to honor that servant's family and claims. And the reason that I say this with absolute confidence is because I come from that kind of family where my grandfather during the partition picked up, there were various infants that had been stranded or abandoned, picked them up, brought them up with his sons. The janeo, the sacred thread that marks the Brahmin, was given to such sons. Their rights then became the subject of a huge fallout. I hope this is not on camera. But they became the subject of a huge fallout in my own family, with my father standing up for them and the others not. And so the reason that I'm very, very sensitive to this issue is precisely because it is not judiciable now. Yeah? That's what it means. That servants can't go to court and say, my master promised me this, or my adopted father or my fostered father. All of these sort of, bleed into each other. Kinship bleeds into employership, bleeds into maintenance rights, etc. So this disaggregated set of terrains which law defines and defends is not available for such people. That's the context in which I think I'm trying to talk about property again. Does that make sense? Yes. Yes.
First of all, very good talk.
Okay.
And secondly, a slave. Is there any evidence? Yes. That that the monks thought of the maintenance? Yes, the maintenance of the slaves and yes, as a religious obligation.
Yes, absolutely. You're spot on. You nailed it in one go. Absolutely. Because this is very, very clear in the Buddhist and the Vaishnava tradition. You know, those who study Buddhism will tell you that every monk who is ordained has to take a vow to alleviate suffering. So it's a religious obligation on the part of a monk to alleviate suffering. So if an ordained monk sees an ill person, it's the same obligation to care as it is for a gifted old person given to the monastery who may not be functional, who may not be young, but has been gifted as a mode of protection, right? So it depends upon how the monastery acquired this person or the family.
A follow-up? Can I have a follow-up?
Yes, of course.
Is it possible?
Yes.
Is it possible that we're talking about two different types of slavery? Like the pre-colonial and post-colonial are totally different? Two different types of slavery, and therefore I mean, you could compare them, but you have to recognize that they're two different types of slavery.
Yes. Okay. The historic, obviously, what you know. Again, you're really hitting everything right on the head here. There are two different types, but they're also separated in terms of time, pre-colonial and colonial. They're two different systems. You have to remember that the old world, the South Asian world, the Inner Asian world is the vibrant economic trade zone in the earlier period. Yeah? People go there for money. It's not the poor dump that it is today. That's where people would go. And it's for what we are describing. Therefore, I think what we should honestly do is talk about the Atlantic system of slave using as a poor man's system. Okay? It's because they don't want to invest in training, skilling, keeping them well. It's a poor man's system. The old world, the context that I'm describing is the rich man's slave system. And that's, I think, a better way of thinking about it, rather than in terms of simply pre-colonial and post-colonial, because they also bleed somewhere in the middle in the colonial. And is it fair for me to say that there are two different systems? for South Asian evidence, what happens after colonial law sets in is not even called slavery. In South Asia, it's either called freedom or it'll be called indenture, when the same people are actually sent off to the sugar plantations in Mauritius. It's not even called slavery, right? It's called indenture. There's a volition to it, there's a contract, and so on. And so it becomes a messy contest around labels. And while I'm willing to go there, I think it's, in terms of experience, in terms of where I was beginning with understanding property law, it doesn't become very helpful. A lot of people have spoken on indenture and tried to address this debate again. But I think what I'm trying to do is a little different. Yeah? Okay. Thank you for those questions. Those were extremely, spot on ones. But yes, I can see another hand as well.
I want to ask about, if you could expand on the third from ecology and of labor, and how abolition might have looked different for different
Groups in that terrain.
and also like the Himalayan belt.
Yeah.
As you said, when it came to plains and the other. The other question is about gifting and how gifting looked after abolition. How does it tie back to the scholarship on dowry and all? Or do you not want to answer that?
No. I'm game. I'll answer all questions. Okay. Ecology. What does it look like in that terrain? Dowry, and what was the second question? Okay. So, historically, the evidence is that because the holders, both lay and monastic estates, depended so much on labor in this ecological terrain, they resisted very hard. In the 1840s and 50s, there's evidence of various of these mahantas, the Vaishnava abbots, actually, protecting their men, not releasing them for army labor, writing petitions, or collecting together and petitioning the company's official, don't take away our. This is the problem. Because they said, don't take away our slaves, the company, of course, had to take away their slaves. Right? They were committed to this abolitionist agenda, and there was no way that they were going to listen to these people unless there was violence. And that's a lesson that I think they learned very early on, in the Northeast particularly, that violence against the company regime, violence against the company's armies was the only way to be heard. Okay. And that's a lesson that is still being dealt out in that terrain, except that the post-colonial Indian state doesn't want to look into that lesson. The second question about how it worked out, because the owners themselves got tied up with lots of sectarian conflicts as well as kinship-based succession disputes, many of the sort of contending factions then deserted one side and went over to the other and brought the outsider regime in and took over power, and so on and so forth. So there was a split within, and very jagged splits within the owning groups, the people who were owned, the tenants, the estates. All of these were very, very badly, jagged, and all that you find in the records is conflict in the 19th century. And very brutal stuff goes on there. So actually abolition, in that sense, worsened conflict, didn't calm it down. But in that conflict also enable the annexation and the penetration of colonialism further and further into that terrain. Yeah? Because armies are being solicited, they are being sought, they are going in to keep the peace, and then of course they have to be paid. So, how does it affect dowry? Well, how does it affect dowry is something that I've been trying to find out on the side. The question is, in the Himalayan terrain, dowry is not the chief mode in which wealth is given. Women there expect bride price. Okay? Men have to pay for the privilege of marrying such women. Women have wealth rights. They have claims of various kinds. So the way that we argue for dowry or think about dowry, that doesn't quite work out in that terrain in the same way. But how does it work out on the plains societies, which we are more familiar with? I think it shrinks what is givable. For instance, my colleague Ramya Srinivasan, who's worked on the Rajput households as a result of this move in diluting wealth, finds that some households then make a pact when a marriage has to be arranged amongst the hegemonic Rajputs, that you will give so, and the girl's side will be told you will give so many, maids along with your daughter, and the groom's side expects to give XYZ so that these maids are set up in the household alongside. That set of records is visible in the Rajput hegemonic households. I have not yet found enough from the East Indian end to tell you how it works and how it's affecting dowry in this context. But the description is mostly anecdotal. So one would need a lot more research into this to find out. Yes?
Question. Greatly enjoyed your talk, and I think the point about reversal of property laws and bondage via freedom is quite useful and important. But the point about the poor man's system, the rich man's system, I'm thinking if we rule out the homogeneity of transatlantic slavery and look at the internal complexities, and look at the situations where some slaves did have significant freedom within the institution of slavery. Imagine the scenario of a female slave in a household situation who actually lost all her rights and all her privileges as a result of freedom, as a result of emancipation when apprenticeship starts. So when you are forced into the world of a free market economy, freedom seems to have the same meaning as you are portraying in the case of India. How do you respond to that?
I'm absolutely perfectly in agreement with that, except that I don't have enough evidence that women slaves in the American plantation systems within the households had comparable rights as the women slaves in the Awadh households.
When you say American, do you mean US or do you mean all of America?
No, I mean North American, the 13 plantations, the
That
colonies. Yeah, the colonies. Yeah, the exact timing in which I'm thinking is 18th century and 19th century. And I can establish for you with lots of evidence that the African and the local North Indian women in the hegemonic households, such as Awadh, such as Shia, Bengal, Murshidabad, and Patna and places, which are all Muslims, have very distinct sets of rights, and they're acting on them and they preserve them. till such time as 1791, 1796. I don't have enough evidence that says this is comparable to the US.
Maybe not in an institutional sense, but the effect might be somewhat similar in some situations.
Yeah, see, look, I'm perfectly willing to go along with you there. The problem is precisely this, that the effect on both sides may be similar, but what the institutionalization of it is in Islamic law is what is lost in the South Asian case. And that's a very big loss from which South Asia itself does not recover. So Muslims, you know, it's a very big source of pain in our lives that Muslims are a huge and important part of our being in India, and yet today we have to, you know, sort of constantly re-excavate the legal system, re-articulate institutions and rights again and again. And those of us who are, by virtue of our birth, born in the majority community, I think have a special obligation to do that continuous work. And so that's the pain. That's the source of the struggle here, that the institutionalization of it has been lost. Does that make sense? And you know, once it's lost, it's lost.
I think we'll wrap up now. This has been a wonderful talk. And
Thank you.
a great period of question and answers. And thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.